And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. We are following several different stories that continue to develop into the late evening tonight. In terms of the time difference, it is 5 hours ahead of American East Coast time in England. So it's after 2 in the morning now in England. That country is now not only dealing with the aftermath of that horrific bombing of that pop concert in Manchester, England last night, which claimed 22 lives. They are also now officially at what they're calling a critical alert level in Britain. We used to have that color-coded alert system in our country after 9/11. We no longer have that. We now have something called the National Terrorism Advisory System, which sends out targeted alerts for specific incidents in specific places. But in Britain, they've still got a nationwide alert system. And tonight, British Prime Minister Theresa May raised their nationwide alert level to critical, which, in the Prime Minister's words, means that another attack may be imminent in Great Britain. Now, this critical alert level means that they are deploying troops in the streets. They are putting the British military in the street alongside British police. There have been raids today in Britain. There has been at least one arrest, reportedly in conjunction with last night's bombing. There has been a lot of controversy about U.S. officials and U.S. news sources publishing the name of the man who's believed to have been the bomber, the suicide bomber. We're going to have more on that story. We're going to have the latest from London and from Manchester coming up just in just a few minutes this hour. Here at home today, new developments in the scandal plaguing our new presidential administration continue to overshadow more current events, continue to overshadow the footage and the pool reports from the president's first overseas trip. We don't know why, but two of the president's very top advisors, his senior strategist, Steve Bannon, and his chief of staff, Reince Priebus, they appear to have been sent home early from the foreign trip. We know that each of them made it as far as Saudi Arabia, which was the first stop on the trip. And the White House insists that the plan all along was for them to just go to Saudi Arabia and then fly right back. But honestly, there is no contemporaneous record of any such plan for Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon. And although we do not know why they have now been sent home early while the rest of the administration is still abroad with Trump, it would not be strange, given the circumstances, if the administration felt like they needed to get some of their top people home right quick, even in the middle of that trip, to try to keep a lid on what's going on here.
That we issued 2 subpoenas to the 2 Michael Flynn businesses that we're aware of, Flynn Intel LLC and I think Flynn Intel Inc., both located in Alexandria, Virginia, with this specific list of documents because while we disagree with General Flynn's lawyer's interpretation of taking the fifth, it is even more clear that a business does not have a right to take a fifth if it's a corporation. So those subpoenas, one has been served, one is in the process of being served, and we keep all options on the table, but we think the committee's moved forward aggressively.
One has been served, one is in the process of being served. Today, that was the Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman, Richard Burr, on the left side of your screen, and the top Democrat in Senate Intel, Mark Warner, on the right side of your screen. The two of them jointly announcing a new round of subpoenas that they sent out today in the Trump-Russia investigation. These ones target the Trump National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, specifically his businesses. Now, we know that Mike Flynn is currently fighting the committee's subpoena for him to testify and for him to hand over documents. He's trying to take the fifth. The committee is now hashing it out with Flynn's lawyers in terms of what he's able to take the fifth on. But meanwhile, as of late this afternoon, they're sending subpoenas to his businesses. And businesses, as Senator Warner said, they can't take the fifth. Businesses are not people, my friend. And if you needed any further assurance that the Trump-Russia investigation is now all about following the money, is now very much about businesses and business ties and banking records and finances. Also consider the late-breaking news today, reported first by Fox Business and now confirmed by NBC News, that the president has now chosen his private counsel, who he will use to try to save his presidency, to the extent that his presidency has to be saved by legal maneuvering. In 2005, a New York Times reporter named Timothy O'Brien went on to be the business section editor of the New York Times. Reporter Timothy O'Brien published this book about Donald Trump. And one of the things Timothy O'Brien claimed in this book, Trump Nation, was that Donald Trump wasn't a billionaire. Timothy O'Brien's book said Trump was worth not multiple billions of dollars, not even $1 billion. He was closer to $250 million in terms of his net worth. And you know, like, who would be mad about that? Right? I mean, once you're a 250 millionaire, I think we can all agree you're spectacularly rich. And who cares if you're just that rich or even richer than that, right? Who cares? But Donald Trump really cared a lot about that. He cared so much that he sued that New York Times reporter, Timothy O'Brien, for that book, specifically for saying in that book that Trump wasn't a billionaire. And, you know, it was clever. In the event that Trump actually wasn't a billionaire, he came up with a way to solve that problem, too, with this lawsuit, because he sued Timothy O'Brien over that book for $5 billion in damages, which is hilarious. And what resulted was a ridiculous lawsuit that was basically a suit in which Trump tried to prove his net worth, tried to prove that he was a multi-billionaire, and that gave rise to the famous deposition where Trump claimed that his net worth rose and fell according to his feelings on any given day. That's how he tried to prove he was a billionaire. And so, no, he did not prove he was a billionaire. He brought the lawsuit, insisting that he could show in court, he could prove in court how much he was worth. And in that lawsuit, it turns out he could not show in court that his net worth was somehow magically larger than what he could prove. He didn't win the case. He didn't get his $5 billion in damages from the New York Times reporter. The Trump lawsuit about that book was dismissed, and then Trump appealed that court ruling, and then his appeal was dismissed. But now it's interesting. The lawyer who brought that case for Trump, the man who masterminded the idea of suing a New York Times reporter for $5 billion to prove Trump was a billionaire, and then not being able to prove Trump was a billionaire once they got it into court, so that reporter won that. The lawyer who masterminded that case is now the lawyer who our new president is expected to retain to be his private counsel, quote, on matters related to the Russia investigation. Sure, why not him? Lawyer Mark Kasowitz also has played a role in the litigation concerning Trump University, for which Trump ultimately had to pay $25 million to settle fraud charges. He's represented Trump in a number of other business matters, some successful, some not. He was involved in the restructuring of the massive and controversial debt in Trump's Atlantic City casinos. His most recent high-profile gig since Trump has been president, though, has been on another matter. And you might have heard about this. You might have heard about this. A few weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago, we actually reported this on the show. The first high-profile thing that Trump's lawyer has been involved in since Trump's been president is that he was taken on as the counsel to represent a Russian state-controlled bank. Of course he was. Sberbank, which is a funny-sounding name if you don't speak Russian and you only speak English, because it sounds like something else. Sberbank is the largest state-run bank in Russia. In the Southern District of Manhattan, there is a massive federal civil lawsuit against Sberbank, basically accusing them of destroying the granite mining industry in Russia in a state-sponsored act of corporate raiding. And when the biggest Russian state-controlled bank needed counsel in New York to defend them on that this year, they picked a man who's otherwise famous for being Donald Trump's lawyer, the lawyer he uses in particular for stuff like suing the New York Times. And now, if these reports tonight are accurate, that is who will be leading Trump's legal team for the various investigations related to the Russian attack on the U.S. election last year and the question of whether or not the Trump campaign cooperated in that attack in any way. And to that point, the man who was the director of the CIA when the Russian attack on our election was happening last year, the man who was the director of the CIA at the time any such cooperation or collusion would have happened if it happened. Today, he testified as to what he saw last year as CIA director. He testified as to what he saw, what he believed it might have meant, and why he believed it was serious enough at the time that his agency took what it had found out through foreign spying. And they handed that to the FBI last summer, which is what started the FBI's counterintelligence investigation of Trump and Russia last summer.
I was convinced in the summer that the Russians were trying to interfere in the election. And they were very aggressive. It was a multifaceted effort. And I wanted to make sure that we were able to expose as much of that as possible.
But was there intelligence that said that the Trump campaign was colluding with Moscow during their campaign?
There was intelligence that the Russian intelligence services were actively involved in this effort. And having been involved in many counterintelligence cases in the past, I know what the Russians try to do. They try to suborn individuals. And they try to get individuals, including U.S. persons, to act on their behalf either wittingly or unwittingly. And I was worried by a number of the contacts that the Russians had with U.S. persons. And so therefore, by the time I left office on January 20th, I had unresolved questions in my mind as to whether or not the Russians had been successful in getting U.S. persons involved in the campaign or not to work on their behalf, again, either in a witting or unwitting fashion. And so, therefore, I felt as though the FBI investigation was certainly well-founded and needed to look into those issues. But I know that there was a sufficient basis of information and intelligence that required further investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not U.S. persons were actively conspiring, colluding with Russian officials.
Did you see evidence of collusion, coordination, conspiracy between Donald Trump and Russian state actors?
I saw information and intelligence that was worthy of investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not such cooperation or conclusion was taking place.
That doesn't help us a lot.
That doesn't help us a lot? What are you looking for help with? Because if what you're looking for is the CIA director's assessment of whether there was sufficient cause, whether there was a well-grounded basis to start the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into the sitting president and his campaign and the question of whether they colluded with Russia, a counterintelligence investigation which continues to this day and is unprecedented in American history. If that's what you're looking for, it definitely helps a lot with that. Because he apparently is the one, CIA Director John Brennan is the one who's basically saying that the information that the CIA was able to observe, what he was able to see as CIA Director last year, was worrying enough that it was handed to the Bureau, and that's what started that investigation. I think that's very helpful to understanding what happened. Former CIA Director Brennan also helped everyone understand today, maybe for the first time in open session, how this kind of thing might have worked. If this was a Russian op, if our election was in part a foreign intelligence operation, how might the Russians conceivably have pulled this off? If there was any American cooperation or collusion with what they did, how did the Russians do that? I mean, if they did succeed in getting American collusion, if they succeeded in getting the Trump campaign to collude with them, how might that have worked? Even if the Trump folks didn't start off intending to side with another country against our own, how could the Russians have done it? Watch this.
I have studied Russian intelligence activities over the years and have seen it, again, manifest in many different of our counterintelligence cases and how they have been able to get people, including inside of CIA, to become treasonous. And frequently, individuals who go along that treasonous path do not even realize they're along that path until it gets to be a bit too late. And that's why, again, my radar goes up early when I see certain things that I know what the Russians are trying to do, and I don't know whether or not the targets of their efforts are as mindful of the Russian intentions as they need to be. It is traditional intelligence collection tradecraft in terms of HUMINT, which is to identify individuals that you think are either very influential or rising stars, and you will try to develop a relationship with them. And the Russians frequently will do that through cutouts or through false flag operations. They won't identify themselves as Russians or as members of the Russian government. They will try to develop that personal relationship, and then over time, they will try to get individuals to do things on their behalf. And that's why, again, having been involved in a lot of counterintelligence cases over the years and seeing this pattern over and over again, my radar goes up when I see that the Russians are actively involved in a particular intelligence operation or campaign, and that U.S. persons are being contacted by Russian officials.
See, in some ways, all of us who are watching this unfold every day in this remarkable news, right? In some ways, we're all a little stumped by the Trump-Russia story, right? Because as Americans, we all know American politics. We know, like, the range of things that can happen in American politics, or at least we thought we did. But things like this Trump-Russia thing, they don't happen in American politics. And so they're foreign to us, and everything about it is unexpected. But you know what? Things like this do happen in Russian espionage efforts. This is foreign to us as politics. This is not foreign to John Brennan as a longtime, lifelong observer of Russian espionage efforts. So ask the people who understand how the Russians work, right? Ask the people who understand how Russian foreign intelligence operations, ask the people who know how Russian active measures against foreign enemies, how those things work. And to them, it sort of makes sense when they look at it through Russian eyes. So hearing about how the Russians approach an op like this, how they approach Americans, how they try to persuade unwitting Americans to ultimately betray our country, that is helpful for figuring out what the Russians might have been hoping for and trying for here, even though we don't know if the Trump associates they contacted went along with it. And there's one last thing that came up today. This is the last thing. And this isn't even an uglier prospect. That was also raised today in this questioning with the former CIA director. And I want you to watch how CIA Director John Brennan reacts here. So they've been talking at this hearing over the course of this remarkable testimony from Brennan. And it ultimately gets to the point where they're talking almost protectively, or at least empathetically, about how some Americans might accidentally get dragged into this, how some Americans might have been unwittingly duped into colluding with the Russians in this attack. They might have been led into it without really even knowing what they were getting into. It's almost a sympathetic portrayal of what it might have been like for any Americans to have colluded with the Russians in this attack last year. But then Eric Swalwell on the committee gets to a very uncomfortable alternate point. He basically says, yeah, bumbling into or accidentally or otherwise innocently helping the Russians, that's an interesting scenario here. But what about people who get caught concealing what they were doing with the Russians? Isn't that a different ball of wax? Watch Brennan's response here.
Director, there is what is referred to as consciousness of guilt evidence. That's when somebody lies about a material fact, and that fact, the fact of them lying, can be used against that person because it would be, in essence, an effort to cover up what happened. Meaning, if you were telling the truth, you wouldn't have anything to cover up. With respect to some of the contacts that you've referred to between Russia and Trump campaign officials, are you aware of any of those U.S. persons who had contacts with Russia either making false statements about those contacts or failing to disclose those contacts?
I think that's something that we can pursue in closed session.
Not an open session. We'll talk about that in a classified setting. So the Russians may be really good at drafting Americans into their schemes against the United States. But once Americans are involved in those schemes and they start lying about that fact, concealing that fact, well, then that concealment, takes it into a closed session situation. So, remarkable testimony today from the former CIA director. And, new subpoenas have just gone out tonight to Mike Flynn's businesses in Virginia. Business associates of Mike Flynn's have already received subpoenas from a federal grand jury convened by a U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia. It has been reported that the prosecutor leading that inquiry centering on Flynn out of that U.S. attorney's office is a veteran espionage prosecutor who was brought in for that purpose from the National Security Division of the Justice Department. The Department of Defense Inspector General is investigating documented claims from the Pentagon that Flynn concealed evidence of his foreign payments from the Army. The Oversight Committee in the House just released documents that appear to show that Flynn concealed evidence of his foreign payments last year on his security clearance application as well. I mean, just on that matter of Mike Flynn and his foreign payments. The White House generally, the vice president in particular, continue to deny knowledge of those foreign payments to Flynn, even after they were notified about them emphatically and over a period of weeks and months multiple times, to the point where the Mike Pence-led transition sent a thank you for your letter receipt to the House Oversight Committee when the House Oversight Committee had put in writing to the transition their concerns about Mike Flynn's foreign payments. So even if you just take that slice of it, just on the issue of Mike Flynn and his foreign payments, when you talk about concealment being a complicating factor here, there would seem to be a lot of reported evidence of him appearing to try to conceal those foreign ties, and the White House trying to conceal them for him. The financial trail is lit up like broad daylight on Mike Flynn, right? And multiple investigations are now thundering down that path like a convoy of semis. But we have learned tonight that there may actually be a problem with the financial side of all of these Trump-Russia investigations. And we've got that ahead tonight, and a lot more besides. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.